we're with Kevin Ward from Biopharma Group discussing how QbD is beneficial to the freeze-drying process and what exactly QbD is. So, Kevin, if you can explain to us a little bit about what QbD is.
So QbD, or quality by design, is an approach that we can take to R&D with the idea that it minimises risk by applying data and prior knowledge right from the beginning, rather than just going into the lab and starting the experimental work. And also part of it is to understand the relationship between the input parameters and the quality of the product, with the idea being that we learn more about our process as we go along.
Okay, and what does QbD involve that's different from the usual R&D process?
Well, QbD involves, I think, more upfront desktop study and assimilating prior knowledge, rather than going straight into the lab, so that you can try to establish where the risks are in the process first.
So it's a more structured process?
It's a more structured process than the traditional iterative R&D process. So we then will look at the individual parts of freeze drying and understand where the risks are, so that we can then try to minimise them, and then hopefully also make the process more robust and minimise any scale-up issues.
Okay, so that involves some prior knowledge being put into the QbD process?
Yeah, so it's a more formal knowledge-based process. So anything that you've learnt about similar products in the past, then that knowledge is actually valued as part of QbD. It's not trying to make us do everything by design of experiments, but it actually values our knowledge on where the risks are, where the difficulties are with processing similar products.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned design there. What's this thing about design space? What is design space?
Well, the design space represents the available parameters, in our case in the freeze drying process, so the temperature and the pressure in the freeze dryer in a given freeze drying cycle. So the idea is that if you establish on paper where your available temperature and pressures could exist, then you can work on narrowing those down to give you a more defined space that then you can then go and test out with the laboratory studies as you would normally do. But it means you can define some freeze drying conditions on paper before you actually get started.
Okay, so that'd be one of the benefits. What are the exact benefits or key benefits of QbD in freeze drying specifically?
Well, for freeze drying specifically, it allows you to understand the risks of freezing and drying sort of individually, and you can then focus on applying the data and knowledge to de-risking the most risky part of the process. So for most people, that will be primary drying. So we can segment the process. So freeze drying is quite a complex process, and one of the challenges in applying it is that the risks are not constant throughout the freeze drying process. In fact, even if you have one set of primary drying conditions and you don't change the temperature or pressure at all, the risks during that time will change, because there are things that are happening to the product resistance is going up. But perhaps in the beginning of primary drying, you might be challenging the trapping rate of your condenser in your freeze dry, but at the end of the process you won't be, so the risks are different. And what QbD allows you to do is to try to take into account the different risks and how they change during the process, and build your cycle around reducing the risk from both the equipment and the product, and you can also incorporate into your design space perhaps elements of the economics of the process.
Okay, so talking again about the design space, what parameters should you or absolutely have to take into account for freeze drying, seeing as it is quite a complicated process?
So I guess the thing that we all have to obey is the laws of physics. So there will be a temperature pressure relationship that you'll have to obey in the freeze dryer. And typically, if we think of the design space for primary drying, which for most people is the highest risk part of the process and the longest part of the process, so it's the part that we typically focus on with QbD, then the right hand side of the sort of quadrilateral that we tend to end up with in our two-dimensional design space will tend to be bounded by the laws of physics. So for any given temperature, you can only go to a certain pressure. You have to be below a certain pressure, and that comes from the phase diagram of water. We also need to think about the equipment limitations, so specifically the trapping rate of the condenser and what we call the choked flow phenomenon, which kind of puts the brakes on the freeze drying process. And then also the economics of the process. We might define that for a particular product, certainly if it's a generic product, where the margins might be quite tight anyway, and then we need to consider the economics of the process, the length of the freeze drying process, and perhaps if the trapping rate goes below a certain rate, then it's no longer economically viable.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. If you want to know anything more about freeze drying or QbD or anything that Biopharma Group can do, please contact us on the details to follow.